For Crema Media's Polity, I'm Sane Dlamini. Bradley Steyn discusses his book titled Undercover with Mandela Spies, the story of the boy who crossed the square. So, Bradley, as a young 17-year-old boy, you witnessed Baron Steyn killing a large number of black people in Freedom Square in November 15, 1988. Can you tell us what happened that day?
So, yes, at the Lillian Magoya Square, which was the Steyn Square. On the 15th of November 1988, I was a 17-year-old boy. I just finished rugby practice at a school in Centurion. Back then it was called Littleton. I don't know if it's still called Littleton today, but I was on my way to go see my mother, who worked at the State Theatre, and we were going to go watch a ballet performance of Giselle, I think that's what it was called. And as I was walking across the square, out of the corner of my eye, I saw this guy wearing camouflage fatigues. He was older than I was, another white guy, and but I saw people were very uneasy when they saw him, and then I noticed he had a 9mm pistol in his hand. And back in those days, that wasn't, you know, you'd see stuff like that because we just recently, the state of emergency was just lifted. You know, this was at the height of the anti-apartheid movement. You know, the struggle was, you know, at a high, and what happened is that, you know, I thought for a second, you know, maybe he's a task force guy, maybe he's a police guy, maybe he's looking for terrorists or bad people, criminals, and, you know, I walked across, a little further across the square to observe him. And I saw him going to this little garden type of area that had this little like pathway, and there were benches on the sides, and people were just sitting at lunchtime or you know, just relaxing. I can't remember what time it was, but I saw him walk up to somebody and just shoot them, a black person, and I was like, that doesn't look like a criminal. They didn't pose a threat. And then obviously pandemonium kicked in, and people started scattering, and people were very scared, and they started running, and there was a little wall around this garden type of area, and I was ducked behind this little wall. I had my rugby kit bag in my hand, and I observed him walk up to somebody else and just shoot them. I think it was 2 people after that. I can't really remember. And I dropped down, and I was like, oh my God, I have to do something, you know, something, we have to stop this guy. And out of the corner of my in my earshot, I heard psst, 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 Kleinbaas. And I saw this young black guy. He had warm, kind eyes. I referred to him as kind eyes in my book, and he said, come here. So I ran, and I sort of dove over the bench, and there was a concrete trash can, and this was just sort of, I don't know if people can remember the old Steyn Square, that big Makanda, the big head of Steyn, and it was right below that where we were hiding, and there were a lot of people there. There were like 4 or 5 people there, everybody crying, everybody terrified, and I looked at this young man, kind eyes, and even he was a few years older than me, like in his early 20s, and it felt like, you know, this guy was like my big brother. He was going to protect me. I felt safe, or I felt I had a comrade or somebody, you know, we were going to figure this out. And he said, it's okay, let's just wait here, it's okay. And then I heard a noise to my left, and I looked, and then all of a sudden he jumped up, and they ran. Sorry, he jumped up and he ran in the direction of the north side of this garden, because sorry, before that we just heard 2 more shots, and he just shot another guy that was just eating food, and I think that's when he snapped, and he jumped up and he ran in the direction. So I tried to grab my bag, and I jumped up to chase him, because we had to try and stop this guy. We had to try and do something. And as I came around the corner, Steyn, this guy, the boy who, well, later on I found out his name was Steyn die Witwolf, shot this guy twice. And I continued to run towards him. He lifted his firearm towards my direction. He saw I was white. And he dropped the firearm. And my whiteness saved my life that day. And I went up to Kind Eyes, and I put Kind Eyes' head on my lap now. And now he was struggling to breathe. He was gasping. His eyes were now filled with fear and terror. And he was bleeding, and I had to stop the bleeding. Yeah, he was bleeding pretty badly, and I had to stop the bleeding. So, you know, I took my rugby jersey and I tried to take my fingers to stop the blood, and he was gasping. He couldn't breathe because he had been shot in the lungs, and he was drowning in his own blood. And my life changed that day, and so many other people's lives changed. You know, people that lost loved ones on at that square that day. Everybody's lives changed.
You had to join the Defence Force after the massacre because you couldn't go back to school. Can you tell us how that affected your life?
So, you know, one of the things I remember, it was almost like it was a slow motion kind of thing, like everything slowed around when the emergency services started to come, etc. And I was there with Kind Eyes, and I remember looking at my hands, and they were red with the blood, and my fingers had started sticking together. We got him into a ambulance, and he left, and my parents took me home to Doornkloof in Centurion, and I got into the shower that night, and as I was showering, the blood from my hands, as I was scrubbing my hands to try and get the blood off my fingernails and underneath my fingernails, I saw it hitting the bottom of the bath, the white tub, and the blood was just streaming down the drain, and it felt like a betrayal. And that's when, for the first time, I discovered what PTSD was, which is post-traumatic stress disorder, which is a incident that is brought on by a act of violence against somebody. In particular, it was the act of violence that I witnessed. And, you know, people all over South Africa today suffer tremendously from PTSD, whether it's from crime or etc. So my life completely changed after that. I struggled with school. I struggled with discipline. The school kicked me out. I left school when I was at the end of Standard 8. My parents didn't know what to do with me because I thought now, you know, anger and violence is the way that you deal with things. And, you know, because before that I was just a normal kid. I was naughty like normal kids are. And I went to a Waldorf school, and, you know, where we were taught that, you know, everybody's equal. You know, it was one of the first multiracial schools in South Africa, and, you know, we didn't see color. That's the way we were brought up. I'm fortunate that I had the liberal parents that I did have too, thank God. And but yeah, so my parents didn't know what to do with me, and so they decided I was too young to join permanent I couldn't join the Citizens Force because I was still too young. But I joined the permanent force, and my parents sent me to the SADF, and I ended up in the Navy in Saldanha.
Tell us how you were first recruited to the project group when you were fired at the Navy.
Yeah, sure. So there's a bit of a backstory. There was a gay club in Cape Town. And because my mother worked in arts and theatre, etc., you know, one of my godfathers was gay, and he had this partner, dear friend, and this person had a club in Cape Town, and there were these these brutish guys that were going around and just beating them up because they were gay. So they told me to come and work at the nightclub doors to keep these guys away. So I started working there, and I met these guys that had a company called Project Group. And it was a strange combination because it was a white guy and a colored guy. And the colored guy's name was Cyril Beaker, and the white guy's name was Neil de Beer. But what Cyril and I didn't know was that Project Group was actually a proxy front, which means it was a secret covert front for a intelligence structure within the National Party government security apparatus. And because that's where, you know, you'd get a lot of intelligence, is at the nightclub. Everybody's having drinks, everyone's having puza, and then they talk, and, you know, so it was a great place to get information. And, you know, we ended up having between Pretoria and between Cape Town and Joburg, we ended up having, I think, over 200 security guys. So yeah, we had a sister company up in Joburg called Trifalcon. But in essence, what we serviced clubs, etc. But we had a objective that was given to us by the head of the security police in the Western Cape, or one of the senior management in the security police in the Western Cape, by the name of Major Andy Miller. He gave Neil de Beer instructions of what to do, and we did them. And you know, because the ANC MK's division of the Department of Intelligence and Security in the Western Cape, the DIS, were really effective with their surveillance. You know, it was better to use us because, you know, people just thought we were just security guys and bouncers and stuff, but, you know, we were working for the state.
How was it like to work undercover for so many years?
You know, it was very, very challenging, but while I was doing this, you know, it was exciting because, you know, they said, you know, you're going to be serving the country, etc. And, you know, I had a constant tug of war, mentally and emotionally, with what was right and what was wrong, because you got to understand that, like I said, a lot of South Africans were brought up, die swart gevaar, the black danger is going to take us out. But I didn't fear black danger. But what we were indoctrinated with back in those days, in the 80s, you know, was die rooi gevaar, the red threat, the communist threat, because in the 80s, the Cold War had just ended between the United States' intelligence infrastructures and the KGB in Russia, and Russia was supporting sub-Saharan Africa. So there was a very strong, well-trained cadres coming out of Russia, etc. And so that was the threat to me, was the rooi gevaar. And we were actually, this is how I found my true north and I found my calling, was we were tasked to go and remove a gentleman from his kaya here in Tembisa, because he had just left Russia. He had spent time in Russia being trained by the KGB. And it was our job to go and to his house, look through all his stuff, look at his pocket litter, seeing if we can get as much information or intelligence as possible. And we took him, and we had to put him in a safe house. And that was the second big moment in my life. The first, obviously, witnessing this terrible thing that happened at Stratum Square, and then it was when this guy sat in a room with us and he said, I can see you big boys and you're going to hurt me, and, you know, you can torture me, you can do whatever you want, but I want to just tell you about one thing. And that is something that the ANC has drafted, and it's called the Freedom Charter. And this mature older gentleman told us about the Freedom Charter and what it stood for, and that South Africa, and that the ANC South Africa was a place for all South Africans, no matter what race you were, no matter what sex you were, you know, and that's what they wanted for South Africa. And all of a sudden, you know, it's like the fog sort of cleared in my mind, my anger, because I was so focused on anger and violence and just so lost from the post-traumatic stress disorder. And all of a sudden I found this sort of light, this sort of calling. Now I had a calling, now I had a purpose, now I had a real mission. And subconsciously that day, you know, I changed alliances emotionally and mentally to try and serve the ANC moving forward.
Can you tell us how you were also recruited now to work for the ANC with Neil de Beer without giving too much?
So it was a very, very difficult time in our country's history. You got to remember that, you know, there's been oppression of people of color for many, many years. The state was run as a security state. It was a security state. You know, we were in the state of security, you know, just because of you know, the violence, etc., that was going on in the townships. And people were very, very bad in those days, and cunning, and you know, there was a lot of deceit. So through the leadership of Commander Joe Ntantla, and the leadership of Commander Jeremy Very and Andre Lincoln, these guys, you know, and within the DIS, Department of Intelligence and Security, we had this small unit which comprised eventually of myself, Neil de Beer, Jeremy Very, Andre Lincoln. Well, they were our handlers, and they told us what to do. And one of the tasks they told us to do was, because the transformation was coming, the National Party government and the security forces were doing everything to control damage. So, you know, they were burning files, they were burning documents and information on who were double agents, who were their assets, who were the assets within the ANC, who in the ANC was working for the National Party government at the time. And, you know, I talk about it in the book. You know, there's actually a part in the book where we talk about in the very early hours of the morning, we found ourselves in, well, we planned, we infiltrated, we got into the offices of the security police in the Western Cape, which had a cover front, which was the railway police back then. And we got into the files, and we started making photocopies, and then we ran out of photocopy paper, and we didn't know where to get photocopy paper. So I jumped in my little Mazda 323. I went to a ticky box. I got telephone book, tore papers out of the telephone book. I went back, removed the classified documents, put the telephone pages back, so the next day, you know, maybe they wouldn't notice. It was risky, but it was very important, because the information, you know, did speak of double agents and people that were actually working on both sides. So that's one of the interesting things. And but the scariest one was, you know, there was this organization called WAM, World Apartheid Movement, which was run by a guy called Vermeulen. And Commander Very and Commander Lincoln, with the guidance of Commander Joe, wanted me to go and figure out and see if we could figure out who was behind the assassination of Comrade Hani. Because these same guys had supplied logistical support to the guys, you know, that got arrested. So we did find out, you know, who was involved in everything, and we handed over this intelligence as well. And you know, and there was another plot as well that we discovered, and because of General Lincoln, I don't want to give too much away. Go read the book, but you know, our country wasn't the same. The rollout of our country wasn't the same because Comrade Hani was murdered. We would have had a very different South Africa. We would have, I believe, had a much equal South Africa today. But, you know, there were people that decided, you know, that his life needed to be ended, which was very, 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 very sad.
So what did you and Neil de Beer worked for, and what was your goal?
A free and equal South Africa for everybody. The spirit of and the vision of the Freedom Charter, the vision of Tata Oliver Tambo, of Walter Sisulu, of Govan Mbeki, you know, these of you know, Solomon Mushlangu, you know, the guys that were fighting for equality, and that's what we fought for, and quite frankly, that's what, you know, I feel we need to fight for again today.
I understand that you had to wait for some people to die before writing this book. Can you tell us why is that the case?
Yeah, you know, well, they ended up finding out that we had discovered all this intelligence, and they found out that we, in actual fact, were double agents, that we were moles within the security apparatus for the National Party government, and they took a hit out on myself and Neil de Beer, and Commander Vieri called us in and was concerned for our safety, and we had to leave. We had to leave the country because they tried to hit us, because they contracted with the Young Americans, which is a very dangerous gang on the Cape Flats. And they tried to take us out, they tried to hit us, but we managed to get away. And yeah, we had to leave the country, and then, you know, I just started writing notepads and writing on, you know, like moleskin notebooks, etc. And I hope that there's people out there that have stories as well. You know, just start writing. You know, you got to start somewhere. It took me 14 years to write this book because I had to wait for this one guy to die, and. Yeah, so when he died, and plus, you know, it's very sensitive, all these secrets and information. And being an intelligence professional, I'm not per se going to give away the secrets exactly, but, you know, because I wouldn't be a professional if I was, yeah. So.
And lastly, are you not scared that some people may not be happy with the information you have revealed?
Well, I talk in the book about the fact that I think the Rainbow Nation was a PR campaign, and that, you know, we didn't address what we should have addressed right there and then. Because look where we are today. Look at the racial divide between everybody, the racism, the reverse racism, the direct racism, however you want to put it. It's awful and it's terrible. And it's not the South Africa that the Freedom Charter, in my opinion, set out to have. Well, there's a lot of parts that are very positive about it, but, you know, I believe if we addressed those things back in '94 and we dealt with our issues, you know, we'd be a much healthier democratic society in South Africa today. But instead, the negotiations, during those times, you know, there was crisis control and crisis management that was put in the forefront of priorities. And, you know, I understand that the Truth and Reconciliation Commission was put in there to sort of deal with these things, but it wasn't successful. Am I concerned about my safety, or the safety of the brave people that I talk about in this book? I've spoken to these comrades, and the fact is that sure, there are threats against me. You know, just there's people that want to come and disrupt things like our book launches, etc., because ek is mos 'n verraaier. You know, I've betrayed my white race. And, you know, very unfortunately, my brother-in-law was murdered on our farm in Mpumalanga and Nelspruit in October. While I was here researching the names of the victims of the Streatham Square massacre, because like everything was swept under the rug in '94, in 1988, the names of the victims of the Streatham Square massacre have never been mentioned, have never been acknowledged. It was just, you know, let's sweep it under the rug as well. So while I was here doing that, my brother-in-law was brutally murdered on our farm in Mpumalanga. And I made a statement, I made a video that ended up going viral, and in the video I said, South Africa, our problem is not a genocide. The genocide happened pre-94. Our problem in South Africa is crime, and everybody is affected by crime. I don't care if you're black, white, Indian, colored. You know how many people die on the Cape Flats in gang violence today? Thousands. You know how many people die in the townships? Hundreds, thousands. How many people die on farms? Farm murders are real, they are there. But, you know, crime is the problem in South Africa, and I'm just grateful, you know, we have the likes of General Vieri and General Lincoln, who are my mentors, who are actually in the police cluster today, and they are now starting to get into leadership roles, which they should have been in a long time ago, in my opinion, because we wouldn't have the crime problem we have today if we had the right security cluster leadership in place. So am I concerned? Of course I am. But the story is more important. The story is about unification. The story is also about, you know, us trying to come back together and trying to sort our stuff out so that we can look at each other and we can talk to each other, not out of politeness. We can look at each other and have a conversation with each other, not because we have to, but because we want to. So I'm hoping that opens that up.
That was Steyn speaking to Crema Media's Polity about his book titled Undercover with Mandela's Spies, the story of the boy who crossed the square.